About a year ago, one of my very first guests came on to discuss DBT and let it slip that they were working on a new workbook. Well, today that book exists, and I'm so excited to welcome back the show's first ever returning guest, Dr. Kiki Fehling. We talked all about the LGBTQ Mental Health Workbook, Find Emotional Resilience, Self-Love, and Queer Joy with Dialectical Behavior Therapy. Welcome back, Kiki.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I forgot that I was one of your first guests, but I'm thrilled to be back because I loved that conversation. So happy to be here.
Yeah, that one was really fun, and I think we'll get to go even in more depth of some of the topics that we were talking about last time. So we'll just count you as a regular, and anytime you've got something going on, you come back and see us.
Amazing. Thanks. Will do.
Okay. So could you start by just giving a little bit of background on the new workbook?
Yeah. So you already said its name, the LGBTQ plus mental health workbook. And this is a book that I've wanted to write for a long time because one of my areas of expertise within providing DBT was giving DBT to queer and trans folks and making it LGBTQ affirmative specifically. Like that was a huge part of my work when I was practicing in New York. And through that work, man, I mean, the way that I say it is just, I think therapy in general can be like this a lot. But for me, working with queer and trans folks within a DBT lens specifically was like self-healing. When I helped them work through their anxiety, their shame, their minority stress, which I'm sure we'll talk about what that means, and help them find more self-compassion, self-acceptance, self-celebration, queer joy, etc. It really helped me figure that out better for myself too. And so this book was my attempt to like take that combined wisdom and make it more available than therapy is for a lot of LGBTQIA plus folks.
That is such an important point that it's sometimes easy or more possible for us to see in our clients their innate value, their innate worth, and than it is to see in ourselves. And I think anybody can relate to that, therapist or not. It's easier to see in someone that you care about their value, their worth. And so hearing those messages over and over sounds like it had an impact for you, which I can definitely understand.
Yeah, for sure. And go on.
I was just going to note that you did some research, even in grad school, I think, on the LGBTQ plus community, or with them, I should say.
Yes, yeah. So I've been focusing on the area of the LGBTQ health as early as undergrad. In my undergraduate, for my like thesis in psychology in my undergrad, I actually did some qualitative research examining and talking to LGBTQ elders and their experiences within the healthcare system. And so then when I got to grad school, my mentor, Eddie Selby, really focused on suicide prevention, emotion dysregulation generally, self-harm. And he was wonderful and allowed me to really focus my research on self-harm and suicide in queer and trans folks, actually mostly queer folks specifically at that point, sexual minorities. And so my master's, my dissertation, all of my personal research was in examining the ways that LGB folks
Hmm.
struggle with self-harm and the ways that anti-queer stress and discrimination and stigma impact those urges. So yeah, I've been doing this work for a long time for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just recalling a little bit, you started that work in undergrad, and then in grad school, you went to a school that specifically trained in DBT. You had mentors in grad school that worked under Dr. Linehan.
Yes, great memory. Yeah, so Eddie Selby was my research mentor, but my primary clinical mentor was Shireen Rizvi, who was a student of Marcia Linehan's. And I spent, I think, 4 years of my 5 years at Rutgers in her clinic providing comprehensive DBT. And there, we didn't focus on queer and trans folks specifically, but I was part of the group of people trying to get more knowledge and information into that research study, because that clinic was a research study, and providing so many of our clients were from the LGBTQ plus community. So that's also where I did start to see some of these clinical connections too.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting how those threads, it's like everything kind of pointed you to this intersection that you're writing about now. Can you share a little bit about why you believe that DBT complements work with the LGBTQ plus community so nicely?
Yeah. So perhaps the place to start is even what we were just talking about of like where my research was and the fact that my clinic with Shireen wasn't LGBTQ specific, and yet so many of our clients were queer and trans.
Mhm.
And that has to do with the overarching research on minority stress, as I mentioned earlier, of the minority stress theory, there's so much research that supports the idea that queer and trans people experience higher levels of mental health difficulties, specifically because of the discrimination and stigma they face for being queer and trans. And those mental health disparities are so often specific to the types of emotional dysregulation that DBT is perfect for treating. So, not only just intense emotions in general, struggles with anxiety, depression, but difficulties with substance use, with self harm, and other impulsive behaviors. And so, queer clients are showing up in DBT clinics often, even if they don't know of that connection. And then DBT is so perfectly composed to help with those specific problems that on an evidence-based level, DBT is a good fit, but it's also theoretical and bigger than that. But that's like the first thing that I'll point out.
I want to just call out one bit of what you just said about the minority stress theory, that we might look at the reason some of these individuals struggle. The assumption might be that it's identity related, and that the minority stress theory really calls out that it has a lot to do with the stressors that the individual is experiencing.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that so explicitly, because exactly, like, being queer is not the thing that damages someone's mental health or vice versa, right? Having difficulties mentally or psychologically doesn't make you queer, as some people seem to believe. It's more that, like, so many queer people are not psychologically struggling, are thriving, are living meaningful, fulfilling, happy lives. And so it's more
Mhm.
about, for some people, the types of stress they experience because they are queer, living in a queer phobic, broadly speaking, or trans person living in a transphobic society. That is what contributes to the mental health difficulties beyond all the trauma they might face directly because of them being queer as well.
Mhm. Okay. And so with DBT, how do you see, well, I guess just starting with, I know many of our listeners have heard of DBT and might even integrate it, but maybe don't really know the bones of what DBT is. So maybe that would be a good place to start on that front.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I bet we will talk a lot about the DBT skills, which are super relevant and helpful for queer people. And I think when people think of DBT, it's usually what they think of.
Mhm.
But DBT is much more than DBT skills, historically at least. And so DBT was created by Marsha Linehan, the psychologist we've already mentioned, to help people specifically struggling with suicidality and who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And as a part of that, it's a very comprehensive therapy, individual therapy, DBT skills group, phone coaching, and then consultation team for the therapist. So there's lots of parts that make it, when you're providing it adherently, more complicated and like really specific to DBT compared to just using DBT skills. And even pieces of that, I would say, are what make it such a good fit for queer people too. Not necessarily the comprehensive structure, but Dr. Linehan, in creating this therapy for people with BPD in particular, created it recognizing the importance and the impact of a person's cultural surroundings and familial like environment, people with BPD also face a significant amount of stigma, and that kind of anti-stigma work is like baked into the manual. And then that cultural conceptualization is baked in. And so even if the initial manual, Dr. Linehan doesn't talk about LGBTQ people specifically, there's so much there that can be just directly applied. So we understand like the stigma that queer people face and the way that we need to combat that to help with their mental health difficulties. Then we understand through the minority stress theory that the ways that culture influences queer people's mental health. And so we need to address that. And DBT is prepared to do that. And then another big piece, conceptual piece of DBT that's worth mentioning is the D of DBT, dialectics. It stands for a philosophical framework that two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. And that was a part of the therapy for two main reasons. Dr. Linehan found that working with folks with BPD, they're significantly likely, because of their emotional ups and downs, their intense emotions, that they're more likely also to have black and white thinking. And so incorporating this idea that okay, how do we take these two seemingly opposite thoughts that you have when you hate someone or you love someone, that common splitting that they struggle with, and how can we help you integrate that into more nuance? And then also, how can we help you across the therapy accept that life is painful, accept that there are parts of life that are difficult, accept that you are emotionally sensitive, and at the same exact time, work to change your life, to change things you don't like, to work to change your emotional regulation skills in general. So the dialectic between change and acceptance. And both parts of those dialectics are so important for queer and trans mental health, not only because some queer people literally live between binary black and whites, right? Whether they're non-binary or bisexual or kind of fall outside of the typical categories of cishet cultural expectations. Dialectics are helpful there. But then there's so many specific examples for what queer people go through where having a balance between acceptance and change is so helpful. The one that immediately comes to mind is often for trans people who do have gender dysphoria from their bodies or body dysmorphia. How can we help you accept the sex you were assigned at birth and what body you have and were born with, while still working to change that to help you get more gender euphoria if that's a part of your trans journey? And that's not every trans person, right? But how can we help you also then do that in a world that makes changing those things more difficult in a number of ways? So that's just one example. But dialectics are hugely important and so foundational to DBT, so helpful for queer and trans folks in DBT.
Yeah, these are such good examples. I was hoping you'd have some that are specific. And one example for me that's coming to mind is for a young person who identifies as male and has a period. And so the importance of, the validation of, yeah, that's where you are, and that maybe there's an acceptance there, while also knowing that that isn't how the individual is identifying.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And even with that basic factual example, the same two different individuals could be men
Yes.
with periods and feel very different about that fact, right?
Yeah. Yes.
One might be totally okay with that in an acceptance-based way, and another might be incredibly dysphoric about it. And for both of them, the dialectical balance between change acceptance is going to be so helpful for helping them move forward and decide how do they want to build a meaningful life given these facts about themselves.
I think that is such an important piece to highlight. Okay, while we're looking at sort of a framework, and DBT is sort of known to be, literally to have a manual, it's, there is a framework. And within the framework, there's so much opportunity for each individual to show up and acknowledge where they are in their process, and for there to be differences, just like the two example individuals you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that is one of the reasons I love DBT specifically. So DBT, like even on the spine of the manual, is it behind me?
Yes, it's up
No. Is
at
it?
the top
Okay.
of your
Oh,
shelf.
up there. No, I mean the treatment
Oh,
manual.
oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. The treatment manual of DBT is actually cognitive behavioral therapy on the spine of the book. Like the title of the book is actually CBT, not DBT. So like I am very cognitive behavioral in my training and my belief, but DBT I love because it does have a manual. It is very structured, but it's what we call a principle-based therapy. So while it has very strict expectations for like how often you see a client or specific types of tools you're supposed to use. With
Mhm.
beyond a certain set of expectations, it's completely flexible. It's principle based. So you get to apply it to help whoever's in front of you, however they need your help to help them.
Yeah, that's a great way of stating it. That's great language to keep in mind. There's a comfort, I think, for people learning it that there are such strict rules, and for those going through the groups and going through the therapy. I mean, there's that great dialect right there, right?
Hmm.
That there's also so much flexibility.
Yeah. Hmm. And I think that the maybe not the last thing, but one of the other biggest pieces for why DBT is a good fit for queer and trans folks that's coming to mind here is within that like framework, at the end of the day, the biggest goal, like the entire point of the treatment is helping people build a life worth living. That's how Dr. Linehan describes it. So historically, working with suicidal people, like that's why that language is there. How can we help you live a life that's meaningful, that's joyful, that's pleasurable, that's fulfilling, regardless of who you were born as, what you've been through, the ways that you've struggled, the pain that you are going to keep experiencing. And you focus and form the entire therapy. Every therapy session is like working towards that goal. And that goal of a life worth living is self defined. So, obviously, therapists have their biases that we need to be aware of like where are we steering clients towards what we think is important to them or should be important to them. But at the end of the day, we're supposed to really take the client's role. And this, so for queer and trans folks who are already like forced in some ways not to follow life's typical life paths, like culture's expectations, because you already are breaking this foundational expectation of being cisgendered and heterosexual. All of a sudden, with my clients, what I would find is there'd be so much openness and opportunity for figuring out what does actually a life worth living mean for me specifically, and then how is queer joy a part of that? And from there, DBT might look really similar in some ways, but every single DBT session you do is going to look different based on what a client's specific life worth living goals are. And for queer and trans persons, they might be really different than some of your cishet clients' life goals. And so that's where it's a really good fit too.
Okay, I want to go on a little journey to talk about queer joy.
Yeah.
And where I want to start with that, because you write a Substack with the entire premise is queer joy.
Yes, that's the idea. Yes.
Yeah. So when you started this workbook, were you planning to integrate that as an important element, or did that come after because you've been investing in this Substack?
What a great question. The DBT therapist in me wants to say a little bit of both in that, like, queer joy was always present for me, like, doing the work with the clients that I mentioned before, like, queer joy was there. And so I knew going into writing the workbook that queer joy was going to be there. And I will say that it's such a good question because as I wrote it and really had to, like, dive into, like, okay, focusing on what do I want this book to communicate, in some ways in alignment with this idea of a life worth living as the end goal of DBT, it does feel to me like queer joy is the end goal for this workbook. And like that's broadly defined, right? And so I do think that became more of a focus and interest of mine as I wrote the book. And there's plenty of queer joy in the workbook. But this Substack, I was like, I would love to just write about this, right? And so, yeah, as I said, a little bit of both. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Okay. And can you give how you define queer joy or how you think about it, especially when you're writing on that topic.
Yeah. So I think about queer joy as it's very DBT of me too, like, a pleasant emotion that is prompted by connecting with, affirming, or celebrating or exploring your own queerness or the queerness of others. And so for me, that can be in my definition, but for everyone, I think that can be like just a gentle satisfaction, or it can be like a really loud, jubilant euphoria. And for me, and the way that I approach it in the Substack, it's not just like being happy and going to Pride and like dancing and drag brunch and kind of like the stereotypical images of queer joy. And I think that is queer joy. And creating art is queer joy, and all of these things that we know give queer people so much pleasure and fulfillment and joy. But it also is like it can be quieter and it's still accessible to queer people who are struggling, because it can also look very quiet and just how can I get better at accepting my full, authentic self? And that being a part of queer joy, because if I am a queer person, then every part of my experience is of a queer person's. And so
Mhm.
even just getting better at taking care of my body, at feeling all of my emotions, including the painful ones, like all of that can become a practice of self-acceptance that contributes to queer joy. So yes, it's like the loud celebration that's a protest against minority stress. And that's a very important facet of queer joy. Like we are happy because we are queer, not just like in spite of what we go through because we're queer. But it can be softer and more just like, how can I accept all parts of myself as a way to affirm who I am authentically?
Mhm. And how do you see that? I love that. I love that definition, by the way. I love the mention of protest. I've seen you
Mhm.
bring that into your writing before. Um, and how do you see that as similar or the same as or different than the life worth living?
Yeah. Often on podcasts, I feel like so obnoxious about my dialectical thinking, but it really is just how I approach everything. It's a little bit of both in the sense of like, it is exactly the same as a life worth living if you are queer, right? Like, building a life worth living, I think, is going to involve queer joy, like inherently. So it is
Mhm.
the same thing. And it's a little bit different because you only really are striving towards queer joy as a part of your life worth living if you are queer. So there's still like a Venn diagram where it's not a perfect overlap, I suppose.
Mhm. Your dialectical thinking is always welcome here because I think it's great to hear it in real time, for
Mm,
for people that are aiming to integrate more of it or really understand it on a applicable level. I think it's really, really neat to hear how naturally it just flows in and out with you, so always welcome.
yeah. Oh, thanks for saying that. Yeah, I think when you really drink the
Embody.
Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. When you drink the Kool-Aid, you really start to embody dialectics because they're so amazingly life-changing, and helpful, I think in general, but especially in today's, like, polarized world. And so whenever there's a question of like, is it more this or this? Like my answer is just always like, well, it's both and. Yeah.
Mhm. One element that you mentioned when talking about queer joy specifically was that it can be a quiet it might not be, a huge display, it might be a quiet shift,
Hmm.
and I think that is something that people really appreciate about thinking about a life worth living with their clients too, because so many of our clients come in and say, "Oh, I don't have a goal. I don't have anything I like." Like I mean, right now it's really hard for me to imagine anything that could get me, to an endpoint that would be thrilling, but
Hmm.
maybe they could imagine what a subtle shift that would feel a little bit better could be. Or maybe they could start to imagine that anyway.
Yeah. I think it's brilliant to bring that up because absolutely. One of the reasons why I moved towards including the like more quiet and gentle joy it's still joy, in my opinion, like peacefulness and satisfaction are still joy. The reason why I've brought that in is because so many of my clients who are queer, who are struggling intensely, exactly like you're saying, and because this isn't specific to queer people, struggle with thinking of the big issue stuff. Like it's so hard to
Mhm.
imagine the loud joy. And so a lot of them have felt alienated
Mm.
by the typical discourse around queer joy. And 100% for any client about building a life worth living, I've worked with so many clients how maybe the only thing they can think of is like getting a dog or like, I don't know, like getting a new wardrobe. I'm seeing that in front of my face right now in the room I'm in, but it really is just, it's not big, like huge things. It's just like, what can I identify one thing that would make me happier and helping them get towards that as a first step.
Mhm. What are your this is like a huge question, but do you have any ideas on how to cultivate that? That might be the whole that might be the whole workbook, right?
Yeah. So wait, for queer joy specifically or like
Yeah.
life worth living?
Yeah, let's say queer joy specifically.
Yeah. Interesting. It probably is the whole workbook, even if it's not explicit. And, I just undialectically separated out life worth living with queer joy. And I do think my answer is similar for both of them. If a person really doesn't know the answer to like this question, like what would make you queer joyful or what is your life worth living, DBTs is one of the things I love about it too. It just like offers so many ways to get super concrete and keep breaking it down into more tiny behavioral steps to help you figure that out. And so to answer your question, I do think like all the way down, step one is can we help a person increase their self-awareness, their self-insight through mindfulness? Can we just help them touch back into their emotions, their desires, their experiences of pleasure and distaste and aversion? And then start paying attention to that simply. So, something, especially because I already brought up the example of the wardrobe, but also because it is so relevant for so many queer and trans folks, like this idea of gender euphoria through clothing. Like, can I just like literally go to my closet and put different outfits on and notice how each of them make me feel, like both physically and emotionally? Like, what feels scratchy versus what feels comfortable, or what makes me feel like confident or connected to my gender, or just like, oh, I like this versus like, no, I don't like this. Like, someone else likes this, or like, my mom bought me this shirt, or whatever the thing is. And just increasing one's ability to notice that is a necessary and essential place to start for a lot of people, even if they think they know what their life worth living is. So that's like all the way down at the bottom. And then you kind of start putting together emotional intelligence, like values work, what's broadly important to me in life, and then figuring out from there what gives me joy, what goals do I want to reach, what community do I want to have, etc.
Oh, that's so good. That mindfulness around and I love how you gave more insight about the wardrobe because that is such an important link. Um,
Hmm.
but that mindfulness about really anything where a person is engaging in and taking that opportunity to say, "How did I feel before that? How
Hmm.
did I feel after that? How did I feel with 20 minutes of that thing versus being immersed in it for an hour?" And just that mindfulness right there feels so valuable.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good I like what you added on there. Like there's so many different ways to explore and experiment and examine and figure out what I like and don't like in different amounts, to your point too. Yeah.
Uh, could you continue on this journey through the modules and how you've just with maybe an overview of how you've integrated them into the workbook?
Yeah. So definitely as I go, stop me because what I will say, the modules of DBT, so there's four for, I guess, again, for folks who don't know, if this is the first thing they're listening to, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT skills are made up of four modules, traditionally, at least in adult DBT: mindfulness skills, distress tolerance skills, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so usually in DBT skills, they're taught not necessarily in that order, but like module by module. In my first book, my co-author and I did like follow the modules pretty explicitly. But in this book, I didn't do that. I did it in a way where each chapter really kind of builds on the next one in a way that I thought made foundational sense or like clinical sense. And so even the example we just went through of in order to get to queer joy, which at least in a really intense way doesn't show up until I think it's chapter 10 in my book, even though the word shows up earlier, because like chapter 4 maybe is like mindfulness, like those grounding skills. How can I like understand my emotions? How can I understand my queer identity? How can I get better connected to myself? So in the book, I start with teaching the biosocial theory and minority stress theory and giving people this like broad umbrella about how DBT approaches queer mental health, or like how queer people can appreciate the ways in which queerness has benefited their life, but then also how minority stress has harmed their mental health. And then from there, I give really explicit coping skills to help people deal with minority stress who get overwhelmed. So these are the distress tolerance skills. And then slowly work through different module skills, which I can say more of if you have thoughts about like what you'd like me to talk about, but getting up to the point of giving them all of the skills they need to practice queer joy, to know what queer joy means to them, and to problem solve the barriers that often get in the way of queer joy, including things like anxiety and shame, which is like chapter 7 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. One thing I was curious about, I know we didn't talk about it at all before. Well, actually, you did mention it, but how do you integrate and how interpersonal effectiveness? Like, what are some of the things to keep in mind in cultivating this joy?
Yeah, so great question. I do talk about the interpersonal effectiveness skills pretty explicitly in this book. Um, And for people who aren't aware, the DBT skills of interpersonal effectiveness are often broken down into 3 main areas, where there's skills for asserting yourself and getting your needs met within relationships. That's the dear man skills that people have often heard about. There's skills for improving the relationship you have with people. Those are like validation skills, give skills, and skills for improving your self-respect. That's the fast skills. And then there's some other skills for then figuring out how do you combine all of those 3 things together to communicate within relationships most effectively. And for queer people, those skills come up so much in a number of ways, probably just increasing a person's ability to connect and create fulfilling relationships both with queer people, because we know that building queer chosen family or queer social connection and community connection in general is so protective against minority stress and so foundational to queer people's mental health specifically. Like, we all benefit from social support, but queer people definitely benefit from getting connected to people who share their specific LGBTQI plus identities, or from having explicitly queer affirmative relationships, which isn't always from queer community, but is often more easily found there. But then within relationships with people in their life who are not necessarily queer themselves or queer affirming, having the ability to dialectically bounce between these 3 sets of skills, like what I want, the relationship, my self-respect, to give feedback to people in their lives who are important to them, but who are maybe hurting them, maybe indirectly, or unintentionally rather, like through misgendering or by always excluding the same sex or the same gender romantic partner or things like that, like contributing to the minority stress. Having this dialectical integration of different types of skills and the way, how can I maintain this relationship, which is still important to me, but is hurting me, while not self-invalidating and, going against my own self-respect. And so, like asking for things that I want. Can my same gender partner come to the family barbecue? can you please start using the pronouns I've asked you to use for me, etc. So those are some specific ways that I think both connecting with queer community more fulfillingly, chosen family, and then getting queer specific needs met within any relationship.
That feels really like an important balance of skills in this time,
Yeah.
because I think people are feeling challenged by relationships, and with maybe the term no contact becoming more available, I think that feels a bit like I mean, it's on the table as an option, which I think is
Hmm.
great, great, great. And we might that skill of being able to first really clearly acknowledge a
Hmm.
person's need and explain what it would look like to you if you were honoring my need or what felt safe and healthy to me. That feels like an important step, like to use your phrasing, in relationships that do matter.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm glad you brought up the no contact thing, because I think that where my brain goes is in the DBT field in general. People have been talking a lot about the ways in which the Dear Man Give Fast skills, the interpersonal effectiveness skills, were created by Dr. Linehan for a group of people that was pretty culturally monolithic. So, like Seattle, Washington, a lot of white women specifically, and Dr. Linehan is a white woman as well. And these skills are absolutely universally relevant. And a lot of DBT therapists have talked more about like the ways in which I treat assertiveness to my white clients to talk to their parents is not the way that some of my clients of color can talk to their parents. And
Mhm.
so needing within their cultural context. And so needing to make sure that can we recognize the utility of this skill and still apply it um, cultural humility and competence and non-judgmentalness with this person in front of me. And where I think that can come up with queer people specifically is there is like this idea of needing to come out even is very white, and the ways that a lot of BIPOC queer folks like don't need to or don't want to within their cultural context, like announce their identity in the same way. And so there can be a lot of very delicate interpersonal interaction, like you're saying, of I'm not going to disown my family and I don't want them to disown me. And that doesn't mean I'm not accepting myself fully because
Mhm.
I'm talking about my queerness or not talking about my queerness in a specific way. And so how can I keep coming back to respecting myself and my values, which include connection to this family, even though they have anti-queer views? Just how can I navigate that? And figuring out how for myself can I continue to make that decision over and over about maybe at one point I will go no contact, but in the meantime, how can I get my needs met? All of them, even when they conflict, which is very common, to be clear, for any queer person, regardless of their race, of just how can I have a relationships that I want as long as I can, as long as I want them.
Yeah, that really is interesting to think about, that it could be oversimplified, and um a familial relationship that isn't totally accepting could be easily regarded, not easily, but it could be regarded as contributing to minority stress or not
Mhm,
helpful in one for one individual, and for another individual, their choice is to be a part of that family in the way that feels safe and
mhm.
appropriate to them.
Yeah, and, like, an involvement in that family might still be, like, a minority stressor, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Like, that person still might feel negative emotions and stress prompted by interactions with those family members, and the whole point is letting them decide for themselves what their life worth living is. Does it
Mhm.
involve relationships with these people or not? And then how can we keep helping them think about that and communicate their needs and get their needs met from that family or outside their family, whatever they need?
Yeah, that's really valuable. Do you have any other, are there any other critiques or feedback that you've heard from an intersectional point of view about DBT skills or anything that you try to keep in mind
Mhm.
when you're imagining each skill from a cultural humility perspective?
Mhm. Interpersonal effectiveness is definitely the biggest one where we have to even more carefully consider the concrete applications of these skills. But in general, the other work that lots of folks are doing for different cultural groups, queer included, is how can we take this skill, which is universal, but then teach it in a way that is more relevant culturally. And so, even as something as there are some folks who have done research into applying DBT and DBT skills in a country in Asia. Oh man. I forgive me, I can try to find it afterwards. But in this country, like storytelling and metaphors are just so foundational to the way that people communicate. And DBT has a lot of metaphors to be clear,
Mhm.
but these folks have taken the manual and Marcia's basic ideas, but then like taken culturally like common metaphors and stories and like how can we use those specifically to teach DBT skills? And so I think people are doing things like that. And I think as therapists, no matter what culture you're working with, like whether it's LGBTQ plus culture or population from a different country or Spanish speaking or like all sorts of different options, right? How can I make sure that I'm not just following the manual and using the examples that were not made for this population, even if the skill is still relevant? And so just being
Mhm.
more aware of doing your due diligence there for who you're working with.
Mhm. I'm gonna tell you a story that was not my proudest moment. An adolescent DBT group one time, this is the I feel like this just spells it out. We were doing a mindfulness activity and I was integrating food, like a trail mix or something, so we could mindfully experience each flavor. But I had a client who had misophonia and was really sensitive to chewing sounds. And so that wasn't effective. It was not a
Mm.
helpful, but it's just interesting to imagine translating. There are an infinite amount of ways to present these things, but sometimes they take a little bit of translation in one way or another to make it applicable to the folks that you're aiming to deliver them to.
Yeah. So often when we think about cultural competence, we are thinking about like race and country of origin and language, I think, but it is more than that. It's even like in a lot of folks are applying DBT to autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent populations specifically. And like, yeah, misophonia is more likely to come up in that space. And so you might want to do different sound things related to that. But even like I thought where you were gonna go when you brought up that this was an adolescent group, like adolescents have a different culture than adults do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's often where DBT therapists who like specialize in adults or adolescents, like there's a reason for that because you learn the cultural and the language that you need
So
to teach.
true. So
So,
true.
yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great point too. The way that our adolescent speaking counterparts talk is
Yes.
just different because their clients are able to receive those messages that,
Mhm.
an adult group might not be able to and vice versa.
Mhm.
Okay. In terms are there any other skills that are coming to mind for you that feel, like they could be really helpful to mention
Hmm.
that you've integrated?
Mhm. In the workbook, you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah. My hesitation is like s- everything.
Yeah.
um, and I guess to be fair, there are two places in my workbook that are still 100% within the DBT framework, but I take the principle based manual and like extend it where
Yeah.
so self compassion is not actually talked about explicitly in the DBT manual. Like there are not skills that are specifically for it, but some of the DBT skills are absolutely self compassion practices. And so one of my chapters is actually all about self compassion. And so I apply that way. So that includes self-validation skills. How can I get better at communicating to myself that my internal experiences and emotions make perfect sense? Self-soothing, which is often just viewed as a distress tolerance skill broadly, can also just be incredible self-compassion practice, whether you're upset or not. And then physical self-care, which in DBT we think about as being, we call it a please skill, and we think about it as being a way to increase your overall emotional resilience, which it is, but it's also for, especially for people and a lot of queer and trans people whose bodies have been policed or expected to be like really specific ways. It can cause a disconnect or dissociation that actually taking care of one's body is very tricky and becomes a practice of self-compassion, because can I be kind to myself and respond to my body, which is me, respond to my body's needs and take care of it as a way to communicate to myself that I am worth taking care of, right? So all of a
Mhm.
sudden, beyond like just avoiding being hangry or hungover or things like that, it becomes a much more impactful and a powerful experience in that new lens.
Yeah, sleep, things prioritizing things like that feel
Yeah.
extra. Could you say more about how bodies are policed or how have you seen people experience that?
Yeah. So there's probably like direct and indirect policing. So direct in the form of, something as concrete as not allowing someone gender affirming care if it's what they want, right? Literally, like you are not allowed to do things to your body that would help you and that you want to do. But then more indirect through cultural messaging in general of like, what does it mean to be healthy or attractive? And often those images are white and cishet and thin and like, right? And
Mhm.
so if your body doesn't fit in those, there can be so much internalization of that policing and self-hatred and dissociation there. I'm realizing the other indirect way it can show up is queer desires, which are often usually like sexuality and gender, right? But not only those, are internal. They're internal body sensations, the way that emotions are, the way that physical needs are. And so a lot of times when you are being told that your queer desires are bad, that's a form of policing, because all of a sudden this like thing that is a natural part of my body experience,
Mhm.
I'm being told I cannot follow, that it's sinful if I follow, that I'm sick if I follow. And so there's this interruption of following one's natural instincts that leads to, again, like that indirect, like, okay, now I need more external guidance for how to live my life and interact with my body because you're telling me that it's inherently problematic and wrong.
Oh, those are such important examples. Yeah, and I think that was really important that you mentioned that it can be direct or indirect. It can be
Hmm.
what you've ascertained about the rules about your body from hearing how the people around you talk about others, from hearing how the
Hmm.
people s make a remark or something less direct versus
Hmm.
being told explicitly, "We don't do that here, that's not acceptable."
Right. And I guess it is worth bringing up because even though it's not as relevant in the United States, like there are still countries where it is
Mm.
illegal to be in a homosexual relationship, right? So that's body policing. So,
Yeah, yeah, really important to mention. I'm glad you brought up physical self-care because I love to end with talking about self-care, and this feels like such an important area that we don't always qualify in that way.
hmm.
I mean, avoiding being hangry isn't that we don't always see that, we don't always see nourishment, access to being able to have the resources to properly care for
Hmm.
ourselves as self-care. I think maybe because they seem like basic needs, which of
Hmm.
course they are too, but that physical self-care aspect is so important. And without that, almost in a hierarchy kind of sense, can you really access other layers of self-care if those aren't in motion?
Hmm. Right. I think you say it brilliantly there of, for various reasons, people might be blocked from physical self-care, whether it's very logistical, like structural, like I don't have enough money, or I don't have insurance, or I live in a food scarcity house, or something like that. But it also goes deeper again of like, if I'm struggling with depression and I'm not taking care of myself because of that depression, it's very hard for me to feed myself or take a shower. That has a negative impact on how you feel about yourself, even if that's not the top level thought of why you dislike yourself. Like, that is having a feedback loop because your body is you. So it's important for a lot of different people, regardless of their external circumstances. Um, and we're often just so on autopilot. So I think really mindfully checking in and taking care of one's basic needs can be really powerful for anyone, whether you're struggling with them or not, of like, here I am taking care of my body. And like, how beautiful is that, taking care of myself?
Mhm. F- For sort of a final set of thoughts, I know that this is the work that you primarily do at this time. You don't primarily see clients. For therapists, or for those of us that are client facing, are there any ideas that you have for integrating this work or increasing our ability to be LGBTQ plus affirming?
Yeah, great question. Those are probably related, even if also separate. I think that to be more affirmative, like at this point, everyone listening, well, I hope everyone listening knows this. Like, yeah, you should know what all the letters in the acronym are. Like, because you're probably going to meet them.
Yeah.
And like the very basic, but and yet still should be said, like not making assumptions. If like there's like a really common stigma for bisexual people, for example, is people assuming what their orientation is because of the gender of their partner. So not necessarily doing that in your intake and really actively trying to fight those types of biases. Similarly, like if you have an asexual person in front of you and you don't ask about that explicitly, you might make assumptions that they are sexually active because they're married or something like that. Um, but beyond that, I think the thing that I wish more cishet people, if you will, and cishet therapists really thought about is like doing your own work around sexuality and gender, whatever that means. Like, uh, gender euphoria is available to everyone, even if it's been like thought about and discussed deeply in the trans space and queer space because of its like life-saving importance in that space. But gender euphoria is relevant for everyone, and like kind of just being like, oh, what makes me feel gender euphoric? Like actually, and like figuring that out. And it's not questioning your gender, although maybe you can do that too, but just being open to the idea of these areas that queer and trans people are more forced to explore and be curious about. And therefore, in therapy, we want you to be curious about them too. But how can you, for yourself, open some curiosity there? And maybe you won't be surprised. Maybe everything will be what you expected. But maybe you'll discover something new. And in that like non-judgmental exploration, that will help you with your practice with clients.
That feels really, really helpful. That feels really important, and I like the distinction that some folks are forced to do it, and
Yes.
so just having that an experience with doing it oneself could really provide some important groundwork.
Yeah. Like, how do you know you're straight? Like,
Yeah.
maybe that's obvious to you, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Really great. All right, Kiki, is there anything that you wanna add?
I don't think so. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so fun. Where can people find you? And this book at the time of release it's being released in June, so is our
Yes.
episode. And I know, go ahead, share where you can find it and all about where we can find you.
Yeah. So the book, the LGBTQ plus mental health workbook, will be available anywhere books are sold, really. But you can also find it and all of my work, my social media, my previous books on my website, which is my name. So kikifehling.com.
All
Also,
right.
please follow me on social media, whether it's Substack, How to Queer Joy, or everywhere else at DBT Kiki.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll do just that. Great to see you again. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thank you.